Thanks for watching our videos here in the Audrain Museum Network. If you like our videos, and we know you do, be sure to become a subscriber today. Help us get to our next great goal. Hit that subscribe button and the bell icon to be notified when we put up great new content. Thanks! Hello, and welcome back to our exhibition, Early Landmarks in Automotive Engineering. For this segment, which we've entitled Great Leaps Forward, I'm joined by Benjamin Chester. Ben?
Great to be back.
And this is, again, your part of this exhibition, because this is all about advances in engineering and driving experiences and all the things that you really count as important.
Yes, I think this car is a great representation of the whole exhibition because it really took where we were at in time and made other companies, not only in America but around the globe, really change their scope of thinking and really advanced us forward.
It's also a great example of the work in competition cars coming to the road. You know, we think about this all the time by saying that racing improves the breed. But in this instance, racing not only improved the breed, it created a breed. And this, of course, the Cord L29 was the first front-wheel drive car sold in America and was such an incredible pioneer. It was not quite perhaps ready for prime time when it was introduced, but nonetheless, it still expressed an amazing confidence on the part of its makers to bring Indianapolis cutting-edge racing technology to the road.
Yeah, like you said, it was another example of winning on the racetrack brought innovations on the street and also some more sales. Maybe not to the level at which Cord had hoped, but it really took the brand forward and they made a mark on history for sure.
Well, they say timing is everything, and the timing of the introduction of this Cord was not perhaps ideal for a number of reasons, but one of the other things is the fact that the advantages of front-wheel drive are many. And one of the first advantages we can see immediately, it's aesthetic. This car sits lower and looks a heck of a lot sleeker than almost any other car on the road in 1929, and that's all thanks to front-wheel drive and the fact that you could have a flat chassis in the back, no drivetrain to interrupt the interior, so the car could sit so much lower on the chassis. It also gives that wonderful long hood look, which is very sexy and really helps to elongate the body, but through necessity. You've got the engine and the transmission and the drivetrain all sitting up here rather than being split across the body. But what were some of the challenges that you know of with this setup as it was installed in the L29?
Well, it was a unique platform, so they were kind of building it as almost a bespoke unit, and it was something that they were kind of engineering as they went, which means they really had to re-engineer the whole body. You know, the 1930s in general were a really traditional time, and you know, aerodynamic cars like the Airflow and other vehicles were coming into play, but people wanted that traditional vehicle, so they really had to kind of re-engineer the old style of vehicle to make this work.
Well, one of the things that is so interesting about the L29 to me is the fact that I had the opportunity to drive this car recently, and you can see that video here on the Audrain Museum Network, and I wanted to love it. But clearly, I saw all of the drawbacks that this particular installation had. It's really heavy. You've got all of the weight over the driving wheels, and the handling, even by 1920s standards, is ponderous. But you can also feel a very interesting thing because of the weight on the steering, it feels like a modern car in terms of the weighted steering. A lot of the cars from the 1920s and early 30s had front ends that got very, very light as soon as the car began to move. You've got a lot of front end lift, a lot of sort of wandering in the front end. You don't have that in this Cord, which on the one hand gives you a great deal of confidence. On the other hand, 4 turns lock to lock, meaning that you have to plan your turns well in advance, shall we say. And of course, this car also had, it was the first front wheel drive car to use constant velocity joints in the steering, which helped greatly. But you can just imagine what those front-wheel drive cars that didn't have that must have handled like. If you could even use the word handling in the same sentence as describing these cars.
Right.
But it's also an interesting thing that E.L. Cord, a part of whose empire, of course, this car was, persevered in the idea of the front-wheel drive system. Because after this car went out of production, they didn't make any Cords for a number of years till they introduced the 810, which was a revolutionary advance over this car. But we don't have an 810 in the show, so we won't talk about it too much. Just to say that just a few years later, by the mid-1930s, front-wheel drive was something that was really usable for consumers thanks to the developments partly inspired by this car and the other work that Miller did in creating his front-wheel drive Indianapolis cars. So by the time you get to the mid-1930s and the Citroën Traction Avant, it was a car that actually could be used on the street in a way that the makers intended. One of the other challenges this car had is that it's very expensive. And for an expensive car, the performance was not there. In the same Cord family, the Auburn, which shared the engine, was cheaper and faster. Not generally a recipe for market success.
Yeah. It's interesting how times have changed, because even back then there were less parts that were used, keeping everything in front. You don't have a long drive shaft. You don't have the parts, to connect everything to the rear. So today it's an easier product to make and a cheaper product to make, but that may not have been the case back then. But surely there were a lot of benefits that you could really live with, including the added space for your passengers and front and rear passengers, being that the whole body was lower. So it's unfortunate that it didn't work out the way Cord liked, but he's the one who really started this revolution. And times obviously have molded to that invention, so to speak.
Another thing which is so interesting about the Cord and the next car we're going to talk about is the fact that they're both products of the great state of Indiana. They were built at a time when Indiana was really in many ways the center of the car universe in the US, something that's unimaginable today to conceive of. But the other product of Indiana is something completely different, and I think is a car that has certainly taken the imaginations and hearts of everyone around the world. Let's go take a look at that one.
Sure.
Thinking about what was going on in Indiana in Eric Loban Cord's empire, it's remarkable to think of that front-wheel drive Cord and this remarkable Duesenberg Model J. When people think about technology and the specification of engines, it's hard for many to conceive of a 1929 car with dual overhead cams, central lubrication, 265 horsepower, and 100 miles per hour in a limousine. But yet that's where it was. And of course, dual overhead cams were not new in 1929, but to have them in a production car like this was something very special. And of course, again, like the Cord, built for the upper end of the market, this was the extreme top end of the market. The chassis of a Duesenberg Model J cost $8,500. That is almost inconceivable when you realize that's the chassis. That's not this car we're looking at here, this beautiful Murphy town car. Because then you had to pay Murphy to build the body for your town car.
And to put that in perspective, the working man like you and me made $1,200 to maybe $1,800 a year, $2,000 if you're really working hard. $8,500 for a chassis plus the body plus the transport plus everything else is absorbent. But there's a reason why Cord wanted Duesenberg when they were on the downhill in the mid to late 20s. I mean, they were basically neighbors, and he knew kind of peeping over the wall that they were doing the best stuff on earth, and their product truly backed it up. These were the best cars on the planet in the late 20s, early 30s.
And once again, racers building great high-performance luxury cars for the street. Sound familiar? McLaren, anyone?
Yeah. And Duesenberg was dominating, and their race cars were absolutely stunning. I believe they won the French Grand Prix in 1923, and just continued to kind of ride that momentum on through the 20s. But this car has some amazing technology, and I believe it actually has a sort of an inboard computer. In addition to all this, that actually tells you where your oil level is at, and reminds you to check your oil, and advances like that from Duesenberg were decades ahead of their time.
And again, it's one of those things about timing. Timing is, of course, everything. They launched the Model J in 1929, and what a lot of people don't know is that every Duesenberg Model J and SJ were built in 1929 and 1930. The company was in business until 1937. They sold the last one in 1938. The final one was bodied in 1944, but they're all 1928 and 1929 cars.
Right.
And it's sort of amazing to think about what was going on, which we will discuss in another video to come about this exhibition. Some of the most outrageous and extraordinary and extravagant examples of automotive engineering happened at the initiation of the Great Depression.
Yep.
So it proves three things to me. I think one is that the imagination of the engineers doesn't follow Wall Street. Two, that much like the sort of the momentum, these cars were introduced at the time when the stock market crashed. The people that were their market didn't lose all of their money in 1929. Indeed, some of them actually made money during the crash, but that's another lecture in economics, which we don't have to do right now. But the fact that there was still a confidence that we could continue, this is just a temporary blip. And so we had to keep pressing forward with great designs. And the fact that Duesenberg, with this engineering, with this incredibly sophisticated chassis, with one great exception, and these incredibly beautiful body styles, was very much the equal of any Rolls-Royce, Hispano-Suiza, certainly not Bugatti. Bugatti wasn't building big luxury cars at this point, but it showed that America could play at the top of the market, as well as Fraschini. Thank you, that's what I was thinking of. And it's also quite interesting when you think about the market and sort of societal impact that Duesenberg has. You know, everyone knows the expression, it's a doozy, which comes from Duesenberg. And the fact that people still today know, whether they know values or engineering or not, they know that a Duesenberg is a very, very, very special car.
Yeah. In this room with all this great machinery around us, you can clearly tell the build quality is just another level up. But going back to society at this point, it seemed like, from what I understand, New York City kind of inhabitants were the biggest supporters of Duesenberg early on. After the Wall Street crash is when the Hollywood boom started. So all of these Duesenbergs were going up to Hollywood, and you see many of them out there, but Hollywood kind of saved Duesenberg from kind of falling out even sooner than they did. But these were, fantastic cars that, reached almost, like you said, almost 100 miles an hour in first gear, something you could, barely even use today. That's so much performance.
It's also an interesting point that the advancing technologies didn't always match up. These are very, very powerful engines, and in fact, this engine was too powerful for the original 4-speed gearbox that was put in the car. So they actually had to revert to a 3-speed non-synchro gearbox, which also did not help Duesenberg's sales. Because people who had a car like this and wanted to drive it fast in a very refined manner didn't want to make sure they weren't crunching gears as they did it. And so again, it's one of those things that when you think about the whole, when engineering and innovation is moving so quickly, how sometimes it takes a little bit of time for things to catch up, like the technology of how to actually best engineer a front-wheel drive car when you've got the great idea and the great engine and a wonderful chassis, but you can't really get the suspension parts to match up with it, or you've got a terrific engine and a wonderful chassis and the gearbox doesn't quite match. So it is, again, something which speaks so highly to this incredibly fast-paced environment, and which we will see in our next video in this series, how the engineers of the US manufacturers took it to 11 on their way to a different number, 16. Thanks.